This wasn't a robbery. Nothing valuable was stolen. The only thing missing from Nancy Guthrie's home was Nancy herself. For those who haven't followed this story, here's what we know. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, disappeared from her home in the Catalina foothills area of Tucson, Arizona on the night of February 1st, 2026. She lived alone. She was in fragile health, a serious heart condition that required a strict daily medication routine, a pacemaker that monitored her vital signs around the clock, and a level of physical vulnerability that made her entirely dependent on that regimen to survive. She was not someone who could simply walk away and be fine. She was not someone who could hide somewhere and endure. When she didn't appear the next morning, the people who loved her knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. A missing person report was filed. Law enforcement responded. The neighborhood was canvassed. Cameras were reviewed. Hundreds of anonymous tips flooded in from members of the public who had seen the story and wanted desperately to help. And then, silence. No trace of her movement, no confirmed sighting, no message that could be authenticated, no sign that she had ever left that property on her own 2 feet willingly. What began as a missing person case, the kind that communities rally around, the kind that ends with a tearful reunion on the evening news, had begun its quiet, terrible transformation into something else entirely. On March 12th, 2026, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nano stood before a bank of cameras and microphones and said the words that shifted everything. Nancy Guthrie was not a random victim. She was chosen, deliberately, specifically, hunted. In plain language, the sheriff told the world that investigators believed this was a meticulously planned attack. Not a burglary that spiraled, not a stranger who knocked on the wrong door, not a crime of impulse or desperation. Someone had studied this house, learned Nancy's schedule, understood the layout of her property, and executed a plan with chilling, methodical precision. He went further. He warned the surrounding community, particularly those in the most affluent areas of the Catalina foothills, that the danger was not over, that the person or persons responsible were still out there, harmed that no one should feel safe simply because the attack had been directed at one family. Think about what that warning means when you say it out loud. The sheriff of a major American county standing before the press, telling the public, this predator is still among you. That is not a routine statement. That is not boilerplate caution. That is a law enforcement official telling the community, in the most controlled, measured way possible, that they are afraid. The evidence that supports that fear is as disturbing as it is detailed. Surveillance footage from the porch of Nancy's home captured a figure in the hours surrounding her disappearance. This was not a person who stumbled onto the property. This was someone dressed in tactical clothing. Gloves, a mask, a visible holster on their hip, and a distinctive black Ozark Trail backpack slung over their shoulder. Let that image sit for a moment. Gloves, a mask, a holster, a bag large enough to carry equipment. Or more. Morgan Wright, who leads the National Center for Unsolved Cases and has spent decades studying crimes of this nature, said it without hesitation. This is the uniform of someone who prepared, someone who did not plan to be identified, someone who came ready for what they intended to do. And crucially, nothing in that house was stolen. No valuables were taken, no drawers were ransacked, no jewelry was missing. The home was not the target. Nancy was the target. In criminal psychology, there is a term for this. When the victim is the only thing removed from a scene, when a person is taken and nothing else is disturbed, it confirms what detectives had already begun to suspect. She was not collateral damage. She was not an afterthought. She was the entire reason that person showed up at her door. Tracy Walder, who spent years working at both the FBI and the CIA, added a layer to this analysis that many people watching from the outside had already begun to quietly wonder about. Nancy Guthrie is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, one of the most recognizable faces in American television journalism, a co-anchor of The Today Show, a woman whose name and face are known to tens of millions of people. Now, Walder explained that this level of public visibility, the kind that comes with being a prominent national media figure, can paint a target not just on the person in the spotlight, but on the people they love, on the family members who live quietly, privately, away from the cameras, on the ones who are easier to reach. Someone, Walder concluded, crossed that threshold with a well-defined purpose, and they knew exactly who lived behind that door. Now here is the detail that keeps investigators awake at night. Around 2 a.m, on the night Nancy disappeared, her pacemaker went silent. A pacemaker is not just a medical device, it is a constant, quiet monitor, transmitting data, syncing with a nearby phone, maintaining a digital lifeline between a fragile heart and the people responsible for keeping it beating. And as long as the device was functioning and Nancy was close by, it was talking. And then at 2 a.m, it stopped. No gradual fade, no slow deterioration. An abrupt, total severance of the signal. Investigators have not stated publicly what they believe caused that disconnection. The possibilities they are weighing are devastating in different ways. Perhaps her phone was forcibly removed from her, taken by whoever was in that house, cutting the link between the device and its receiver. Perhaps the pacemaker itself sustained some form of damage during whatever happened in those dark hours. Or perhaps, and this is the possibility that no one wants to say directly, Nancy herself was no longer in a condition that allowed her body to transmit anything at all. There is no gentle way to sit with that last possibility. Her medications were found untouched inside the house. Every prescription, every pill. The entire carefully organized regimen that her doctors had made clear she could not survive without. Left behind. Undisturbed. As if whoever took her either didn't know what those bottles meant or simply didn't care. For someone with a severe cardiac condition, missing a day of treatment is serious. Missing a week is potentially fatal. Missing weeks upon weeks in unknown conditions without any medical care brings survival odds that specialists describe as virtually zero. And yet the bottles sat there, untouched, waiting for someone who never came back to take them. And the messages. In the early days after her disappearance, the reports began surfacing that ransom demands had been sent, requests for cryptocurrency payments in exchange for Nancy's safe return. For a brief, agonizing moment, those messages felt like proof that she was still alive, that someone had her, that there was still something, anything, to negotiate. But investigators looked closer, and what they found shattered that fragile hope. No photographs, no audio, no verified proof of life. Nothing that confirmed Nancy was breathing when those messages were composed. In every legitimate kidnapping investigation, a captor's most powerful tool is the hostage. A living hostage creates leverage. A living hostage is what gets demands met. And a kidnapper who wants something will always provide proof that the person they are holding is still alive. There was none. Or the messages could not be authenticated. Investigators suspect some may have come from opportunists, the kind of predatory strangers who circle every high-profile tragedy, crafting false communications to exploit grief for financial gain. It happens more often than most people realize, and it poisons every investigation it touches. It forces detectives to chase shadows while the real trail goes cold. But even setting aside the question of who sent those messages, the absence of proof of life is its own answer. A silence that tells investigators far more than any demand ever could. By mid-March, investigators stopped using the word rescue. Morgan Wright said what the evidence had been building toward for weeks. This case has entered nobody homicide territory. That is the clinical term. Cold, precise, and devastating that law enforcement uses when they believe a person is dead, but have not yet found the remains to confirm it. When justice must be constructed not from a body on a table, but from blood on a porch, from a severed signal at 2 a.m., from medications left untouched, and from a plan that appears to have gone violently and irreversibly wrong. Wright was direct about the factors that brought him to that conclusion. Nancy's age, her heart condition, the complete absence of any authenticated contact, the weeks that had passed. Each of these alone is deeply concerning. Together they form a picture that seasoned investigators recognize, not because they want to, but because they've seen it before. Rick Castigar, a former deputy chief in Pima County, unexplained the theory that has taken hold among those who have studied this case most closely. The original plan, he believes, was a kidnapping for ransom. Nancy, elderly, vulnerable, and connected to a nationally known daughter, was meant to be held as leverage. Money was meant to change hands. And then she was meant to come home. But somewhere in the execution of that plan, something went catastrophically wrong. Maybe the situation escalated beyond what the perpetrators could control. Maybe Nancy's health deteriorated faster than they ever anticipated. Maybe panic replaced planning and cold calculation gave way to chaos. Whatever happened, the communication stopped. The contact ceased. And the silence that followed has never broken. Without Nancy alive, there is no ransom. There is no negotiation. There is no leverage left to hide behind. The silence, Castigar said, is not patience. The silence is what comes after. And then there is Savannah. In the weeks since her mother's disappearance, Savannah Guthrie has said very little publicly. That restraint is understandable. Detectives in cases like this often ask families to manage their communications carefully, to avoid saying anything that might compromise an active investigation or tip off a suspect who is still watching and still calculating. But what Savannah has said, the words she chose in the moments when she could no longer stay completely silent, landed with a weight that the people following this case will not soon forget. In one post, she spoke of her mother with a tenderness that felt less like a plea for a safe return and more like a eulogy being written in real time. She raised gently and with profound faith the possibility that her mother might already be gone, that Nancy, a deeply religious woman who had built her entire life around her belief, might already be in the presence of the God she spent her life loving, reunited with her parents, with her brother Pearson, with the people who had left this world before her. She was not announcing a death. She was doing something in some ways more heartbreaking. She was saying goodbye, quietly, while the world was still watching. Later, the family released a formal statement expressing their singular wish to bring Nancy home, to honor her memory, and to lay her to rest in her final resting place. Those three words, final resting place. Investigative journalist Brian Anton, who has covered this story relentlessly since the first night, noted what many were feeling but couldn't quite articulate. Families searching for someone alive speak of reunions, of rescues, of coming home to a warm house and a waiting meal, and arms that haven't let go yet. They do not speak of final resting places. That is the language of grief that has already begun its work. A family that has received information privately, that is processing a reality they are not yet permitted to name publicly. When the words change that profoundly, something has shifted beneath the surface. And in this case, the shift was unmistakable to anyone who was paying close enough attention. Through all of this, through the searches and the silence and the heartbreak, the investigation itself has become its own wound. Sheriff Chris Nanos has faced some of the sharpest criticism directed at a law enforcement official in this region in years. A crime scene released too early, then sealed again after journalists photographed blood droplets that forensic examiners had overlooked. Surveillance footage from nearby properties that critics say wasn't collected quickly enough in that critical first 48-hour window. That golden window investigators describe as the only time when everything is still recoverable, before memories blur and digital systems overwrite themselves and the cold trail becomes permanently frozen. Troy Hillman, a retired homicide sergeant from Phoenix, explained the cascading damage that follows when a crime scene is compromised. Every fiber, every fingerprint, every footprint that gets disturbed by unauthorized contact is gone forever. A scene that has been opened and closed multiple times no longer tells the same story it told on the first night. The truth, quite literally, can be walked away with on the sole of someone's shoe. And then there was the image that the Tucson community couldn't shake. The sheriff, photographed at a college basketball game while Nancy's fate was still entirely unknown. He explained that the tickets had been purchased in advance. It didn't matter. In a community consumed by grief and fear, sitting with the unbearable image of not knowing where a missing grandmother was, the sight of an elected official in an arena cheering at a game was a wound that couldn't be explained away. A recall effort was launched against him. His own department issued a vote of no confidence. Political rivals circled. The Pima County Board of Supervisors convened to review statements he had previously given under oath. former FBI agent Jennifer Coffendafer said something that cut through all of it. Once the public believes investigators have failed a victim, that shadow never fully lifts. No matter how good the work that follows, the doubt has already taken root. In a case that depends on community trust, on tips from neighbors, on witnesses willing to come forward and say the thing they've been afraid to say, that loss of faith is not just reputational damage, it is investigative damage. Real, structural, permanent, and it cannot be undone. So where does that leave us? The reward for information in the Nancy Guthrie case has climbed to $1 million. The case file remains open, and authorities insist publicly that the search is still active, that no final conclusion has been officially reached, that the possibility, however remote, of finding Nancy alive has not been formally ruled out. But the language tells a different story. The investigators speak carefully when the cameras are on them. The family has begun to grieve in public. The analysts who have devoted their full professional attention to this case have reached a consensus that the facts refuse to soften no matter how much any of us wish they would. Nancy was 84 years old. She had a failing heart. She had no medication. She had no authenticated contact with anyone who loves her across weeks that stretched into more weeks. And the person who took her came prepared, came armed, came with a plan, and then disappeared as completely and as totally as she did. Somewhere out there may be a person who knows the road they drove that night, who remembers the weight of what they carried, who has replayed that night in their mind so many times that it has started to change the shape of who they are and how they sleep and what they see when they close their eyes. Cases like this are not solved in press conferences. They are not solved by cameras or reward posters or viral videos. Though all of those things matter, they are solved when one person, one witness, one conscience, one person who has been carrying something too heavy for too long finally decides they can no longer bear the weight of what they know. Nancy Guthrie was someone's mother, someone's grandmother, a woman of quiet faith who loved her family and her God and her peaceful life in the Arizona hills. And she deserved to grow old surrounded by the people who loved her. She deserved a goodbye that was gentle and full of grace, the kind of ending that matches the kind of life she lived. Whatever happened in those dark hours of February 1st, whatever truth is still buried somewhere out there waiting, she deserves to be found. And the people who did this deserve to answer for it. Every single day that passes without answers is another day that justice waits. Another day that Savannah Guthrie wakes up not knowing. Another day that a family grieves without the ability to grieve completely because there is still no place to go and lay flowers and say a final goodbye. Nancy deserves that. Her family deserves that. And the truth, no matter how dark, no matter how painful, deserves to come to light. Nancy Guthrie has still not been found. Now, the investigation remains open. If you have any information, contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department. The reward is $1 million. Share this story, because sometimes the one person who holds the answer just hasn't seen the right video yet.